We all know that the Levium, the Levites, are a chosen group of people who would assist the Kohanim, the priests, in the Holy Temple. But that was not the original plan, it would seem. The original plan was for the firstborn to be the ones that would serve in the temple, to be special servants of God. But because the firstborn were engaged in the creation of the golden calf, they were deprived of that special honor. Although it says that in the Messianic age, it'll return to them. But it was taken away from them and instead given to the tribe of Levi. So every Levi redeemed, you could say, every firstborn and rehabilitated them in a certain sense, redeeming them from their iniquity. But when they counted the Levium, the Levites, and they counted the firstborn, there were an addition of 277 additional firstborn that were not redeemed by their Levi brothers. So there were now 277 that needed to be redeemed. So the Torah says that God says to Moses, take the Levites in place of all the firstborn among the children of Israel, and the Levites will be mine. Now, it goes on. The firstborn of the children of Israel exceeds the Levites by 273. If I said 277, I misspoke. And they need redemption. So they would take 5 shekel per head and give it as a substitute as a redemption for the firstborn. So we have a number over here of 273. Nothing in the Torah is insignificant. Every word chosen by the Torah, every story in the Torah, every concept in the Torah is precise, that has deep meaning and relevance to us as well. There's no such thing as learning a part of the Torah, whether it's a verse, whether it's a chapter, whether it's a part of the oral Torah, that is distant from us, that has no relevance to us. Everything has relevance. So the question has been raised, what is the relevance of the number 273? There's a Hasidic work from a Hungarian rabbi known as the Arugas Habosem that gives a very beautiful explanation as to the significance of the number 273. 273, in Hebrew, numbers and letters are the same. Every letter is a number, and every number is a letter. So 273 gives us the word rega. Rega means an instant, a moment, a second. So what does the Torah want to tell us? The importance of every second, of every moment. That there's no such thing as a second or a moment that is insignificant, that can go to waste. Every second counts. There's no such thing as killing time. Well, there is a thing of killing time, and it may be an appropriate way of describing wasting time, because just like we talk about killing a person, that would be a heinous crime. In a certain sense, killing time is also a heinous crime, because every second has meaning, number one. And number two, we could accomplish so much in 1 second. Let's take the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. The Midrash tells us that when God created the world, he created it with a purpose. And the purpose was that the Jewish people eventually would come and they would accept the Torah. And it says in the Talmud and Midrash that when the world was created, it was trembling. And what does that mean, trembling? That it was very insecure, because no one knew at that time whether the Jewish people would accept the Torah. If the Jewish people would not accept the Torah, the world would have no purpose and would revert to nothingness. So in a certain sense, the world was in a state of trepidation, shaking because of the insecurity. And that's why it says in the Torah that Vayhi erev, vayhi boker, yom hashishi. There was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. Instead of saying fifth day, it says the sixth day. The definite article here is used. And our sages tell us because the world was waiting for Yom Hashishi, the sixth day of the month of Sivan, the day in which the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. So we know that the world was waiting with bated breath for the Jewish people to say to God, when God approached them with the Torah, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we will then hear what it's all about and try to understand it. By saying those words, which takes a second or two, that validated not just the existence of the Jewish people, but of the whole universe. The whole world was given a purpose and a reason, a legitimacy to exist because of that second that it takes to say Na'aseh v'nishma, and the world was mollified. The world was now tranquil and serene and secure and at peace. And that is the way the world exists to this day because of those fateful words that we said, Na'aseh v'nishma. So you see that just a few seconds could alter the whole state of the universe. And likewise, every person in his or her own lifetime, we have moments that if we took advantage and we seized the opportunity, we could change everything. The Talmud talks about how a certain very horrible sinner sinned his whole life, and then he realized how low he had sunk. He went to a valley and he put his head between his legs. He cried himself to death. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the leader of the Jewish people, said, it's possible for a person to acquire his world, to save his existence in one moment. Just one moment that it took for him to express remorse. Well, that's not the conventional way of doing it. No one is asking people to cry themselves to death. But the point is that we can take advantage of one moment and thereby alter our whole lives. We can transform ourselves. You know, Bilam was the heathen prophet. He was the counterforce to Moses. The Midrash says that when the Torah tells us Moses was the greatest prophet and no other prophet ever arose like Moses, the Midrash says, except for Bilam. Amongst the nations, Bilam had certain similar powers that equaled those of Moses. But Bilam was a lowlife. Bilam was a vile creature. And he had in mind to curse the Jewish people with the worst of curses. And we know that God transformed his curses into blessings. But we also know that whatever he wanted to curse was paralleled by the blessing, the reverse of what his curses are. So we know from the blessing what curses he wanted to give. But the question is, how did his curses work? So the Talmud says an interesting thing, that there's one instant in the day that God gets angry, which means that God's attribute of justice, very strict justice, is dominant. And if you curse someone, if you create and generate negative energy about that person, because God is in that state of judgment, it could harm that person. So he was planning to curse the Jewish people at that moment, and God did not get angry that day, the Talmud says. God did the Jewish people a great kindness, because if God had gotten angry, and Bilam, the great prophet he was, knew that moment, that would have been the end of the Jewish people. So the question is asked by the super commentary on the Talmud, Tosfot, what kind of curse could he have said in one instant? I mean, if you want to utter some juicy curses, you need more time. So one of the answers the Tosfot gives that there's one word that takes a second to say that Bilam could have used, and that word is kalem, destroy them. That was Bilam's intention, to say that word kalem. But if you look at the word kalem, and you read it backwards, it reads melech, king. What he tried to do is take away the ability for the Jewish people to have the final redemption through Mashiach. And in fact, when he did prophesize the Mashiach, when he says, I see it, but not now, I see it, but not close. Rashi and Maimonides, both, each in a different way, say that verse, parts of that verse, a series of verses, refer to the prophecy about Mashiach. That was the prophecy about Mashiach that he wanted to undermine, that he wanted to reverse, that Mashiach should not come. Kalem, destroy them, take away their melech, reverse the melech, the power of royalty, that Mashiach would be a king, the final king of the Jewish people. Take that away. That was his intention. And in fact, even when he uttered the blessing, he says, not now, it's going to be in the distant future. He tried to distance the redemption as far as he could. And all that could have happened in 1 second. In that 1 second, Bilam could have successfully destroyed the Jewish people and dashed their hopes for the coming of Mashiach and the final redemption. We know, as the Talmud says repeatedly, God's attribute of kindness, his measure of goodness, is greater, much greater than the measure of judgment. So if in the negative sense, 1 instant of a curse by Bilam could have eliminated the prospects of the Jewish people's redemption, then we know that 1 instant of embracing Mashiach, embracing the final redemption, could actually bring about the final redemption. So what can we possibly do in 1 instant? So here's where we have the message that the Rebbe gave us in the year Tafshin Memches, that was 1988. And here the Rebbe said an interesting thing. We find in the scripture, in Tanakh, that people would say, when they coronated a king, or otherwise, they would say, Yechi HaMelech, long live the king. That's where that expression comes from. It's a biblical expression. What was the point in saying that, long live the king? Was it a nice wish? Was it just a way of honoring the king by saying that? So the Rebbe explains it's much more than that. You see, the power of kingship, the power of kingship, which is royalty, divinely ordained royalty, not just someone who usurps power and declares himself to be a dictator. That's not a real king. That's not what we're waiting for. Mashiach is not a dictator. Mashiach is someone who's chosen by God to be the leader, but someone who is so utterly humble that the power to lead is so deeply embedded in them that they don't want to lead. They don't want to have power. They don't want to control and dictate to others. They want to remain devoted to God in a private setting. So in order to elicit the power of kingship from them, it requires the devotion of the nation. There's an expression in Jewish sources, Ein melech below am. There's no such thing as a king without a nation. A king has to have a nation. That means that the people are the ones who elicit that power of royalty, of power of a king from the king. And how do they do that? When they say Yechi HaMelech, long live the king, what they're doing is they're saying we are giving power to the king. We're giving life to the king, but not the physical life, but life, royal life, the life that Mashiach needs to bring the world out into the ultimate state that it's supposed to reach, which is the state of redemption. So that when we say those words, and we think those words at least, it takes only a second or two, we could cause Mashiach's presence to be revealed. And the Rebbe went a step further. He said, while this is true about any real king, that the king needs the nation to submit themselves to him and to plead with him to become their leader, it's even greater with regard to Mashiach. In other words, the relationship between the nation and the leader is greater with Mashiach than any other leader. Why is that? So the Rebbe quotes the work of Reb Nachum of Chernobyl, an early Hasidic master, disciple of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich, and he writes there that every one of us has a spark of Mashiach in us. When we awaken that spark of Mashiach in us, we cause Mashiach to be able to awaken his power of leadership. So our connection with Mashiach is greater than the connection of just any group of people and their leader. There's a very powerful spiritual connection. And therefore, when we say those words, Yechi HaMelech, or when we submit ourselves, that we are willing to accept the authority and the role of Mashiach in our lives. And what is the role of Mashiach as a leader? Mashiach is not going to change anything. The greatest test to exclude someone from being identified as Mashiach is if he says, I'm coming to change Judaism. The second he says, there were 613 commandments, I'm going to add a 614th or detract, make it to 612. He's not Mashiach. That's the greatest disqualifier, because Mashiach, Maimonides says, is going to restore our ability to fulfill all of the mitzvahs, even those that we can't do today, because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash. So all of this can happen in one instant. One instant could change the whole world for the better.